Well, hello, my name is Barry Corey, president of Biola, a Christian University here in Southern California. And I'm delighted to introduce my conversation partner today, the commentator, the author, the Harvard Law School graduate, and devout Christian, David French. David's got a new book out. We're going to be discussing it today. It was published, I believe, just before the 2020 presidential election, and it's called Divided We Fall: America's Secession Threat and How to Restore Our Nation. An experienced attorney in the field of religious liberty, David served as senior counsel with ADF, among others. He's the past president of FIRE, which many of you know is the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. And he's a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. David's writings can be found at thedispatch.com, which I receive regularly, especially grateful for his Sunday morning postings, which always end with a wonderful song of inspiration. He also you can find his writings on at Time, where he contributes as a columnist, and other places as well. David, I first became familiar with you during your years writing for National Review, and I've observed your development into what many would describe as a voice of reason amidst the cacophony. That's the best way I can say it. Yeah. And certainly your intent is to bring a principled voice of conviction and courage to your articles and to your speaking. And it's very evident in this new book of yours. You've been really forthcoming about the cost that you have paid. Even last Sunday, I read of that, and being vocal about your principles, taking some heat along the way. And no one, though, can doubt your consistency in the positions that you've taken. So I want to get into the conversation in just a moment. But before I do, I just want to thank you again for coming to Biola University this past October, right around election time. It was a crazily busy time for you. The meetings were physically remote, and you were on campus, but broadcasting widely. And that's like one of these COVID things that we're dealing with. But it's an honor to have you at Biola. I know you've been to other CCCU institutions as well. You're a graduate of one, Lipscomb University there in Nashville. And so you're well acquainted with what we do in Christian higher education. So long prologue, David. Now, I want you to help us reflect a little bit on this current moment and what it presents in the way of opportunities and challenges to our Christian college communities, because these are the listeners that will be following on this podcast, as well as reviewing it in the Advanced magazine. So I'm going to start with a basic question, just for the benefit of those who haven't read the book yet. Can just provide a quick summary of the main arguments for your book?
Yeah. So when I wrote it, and I had the subtitle that talked about a secession threat, I expected most people to look at that and say, really? Seriously? Are you going that far? We're divided. Yes, we know, but are you going that far? And now what I'm finding people saying is, how can we stop this from happening? Because the developments since the book was published in September in the United States have been so dramatic. There's been so much evident division and violence. But essentially what the whole thesis is in the first paragraph. And it makes two declarations. One is, we cannot guarantee the continued unity of the United States. Why? And because there is no single truly important social, cultural, political, religious force that is pulling Americans together more than it's pushing us apart. Whether it's the concept of negative polarization, where we join a political party, not so much because we love that party's positions, but because we despise or fear the other side, or it's the big sort, where we are clustering into like-minded communities, like-minded states, like-minded cities, or whether it's this concept of the law of group polarization, where you cluster with people of like mind, you tend to become more extreme. And I walk through all of these big, sweeping cultural developments that show that what they're all doing is they're just pulling us apart, to the point where our divisions are growing so great and our animosity is growing so great that we're going to put strains on our union. And I think nothing illustrates the combination of animosity and division more than what happened on January 6th, which was unthinkable even as recently as January 5th. I mean, if you had said that the Capitol was going to be overrun and invaded and taken over on January 5th, someone would have said, you're an alarmist, you're pearl clutching, it's absurd, it's ridiculous. But what happened on January 6th was the product and hopefully the end, but may not be the end, but the product of years of accumulated animosity and division and often just outright hatred.
Thank you. Well said. Great diagnostic. Let's talk about prescription. I know that, I know my friends that I have that are like this, and sometimes I feel this way. And many college students I talk to, they're about ready to throw in the towel
Yeah.
over this whole polarization thing. They don't know if it's possible to even speak up in a helpful way without being shut down. And on top of that, we've got this, the best way to say, a toxic effect of social media. Some would go so far as saying like it's social media's fault. So given this, I mean, hope most of your book's readers would be rooting for greater unity and not secession. So maybe
Right.
what are some of the suggestions you offer in the book to combat these troubling trends of division, David?
Yeah, the book is not advocating separation, it's warning against it. So yeah, so I think what we have here is there's a necessity of a heart change, and there's a necessity of some policy changes. And the heart change has to precede the policy changes. Otherwise, there's no will for the policy changes. So what are the heart changes? Well, one of the things that we have seen is that amongst hyperpartisans, those are the individuals who are truly driving American political discourse, there is an increasing desire not to shun accommodation in favor of domination. That the goal is to not just defeat somebody politically or to slowly but steadily create cultural change, but to crush, to destroy, to annihilate, and to eradicate, in essence, from the public square. You see some of this as evidenced in cancel culture properly understood. Now, that's a very fraught term because cancel culture is not any criticism you receive, or cancel culture is not the same as consequences for bad acts. Sort of more properly understood, cancel culture would be an extremely excessively punitive action against speech that is relatively mainstream within what is sort of called the Overton window of American cultural and political discourse. But that kind of cancel culture sort of type mentality, properly understood, is evidence of this desire to dominate rather than accommodate. And one of the things that I try to do in the book is I have to say we have to rediscover what actual tolerance is. What is actual tolerance? It's an often misunderstood term, and it's one that is. Let me put it this way: there's a person who writes under the pseudonym Scott Alexander, and he is a psychologist living in deep blue America, and he talks about how he talks to his progressive friends, and he says, "Are you tolerant?" And they'll say, well, "Yeah, I'm absolutely tolerant. I love people regardless of race, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity." And then Scott says, well, what's wrong with them? What's wrong with those people? And the response is, well, nothing. Of course, nothing's wrong with them. And his response is, well, what are you tolerating then? Tolerance is not a synonym for affection. There is something you're overlooking to accept somebody into the body politic. It's not a synonym for affection. So my book is not a call for kumbaya, for everybody to love each other, but we have to have a basic commitment that says each one of us is entitled to sort of build our own home within this land. And I connect it to Micah 4:4, the verse that Lin-Manuel Miranda repopularized through George Washington. But in reality, George Washington used this verse almost 50 times in his writings and describing the new nation that he was leading, including very famously with the Hebrew congregation of Rhode Island, where he said, every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid, which is a beautiful depiction of, in many ways, it's a beautiful depiction of a pluralistic society. Every man shall sit under his own vine and his own fig tree, and no one shall make him afraid, which cuts against the grain of our current thinking, which seems to be, you can't have your vine or fig tree unless you agree with me, unless you're part of my tribe or my coalition.
Yeah, so that's great. We have some fig trees that are awfully close in proximity to each other. So we are living in a world when there's hard to have separation and distance. And And I talk about at Biola living a life with what I call a life with a firm center and soft edges, as opposed to kind of a
Right.
squishy center and hard edges. And by firm center, I really mean a commitment to that which is true, and above all, God's truth. And soft edges means hospitality and kindness, especially towards those we don't think like or vote like or believe like or whatever. But it also means we can partner with and listen to and learn from those who hold different views. So far from a slippery slope argument, which it's not, I believe this sort of engagement only makes us stronger. So um, the role of the Christian college in this, maybe even reflecting on your own formation at Lipscomb, like
Hmm.
maybe unpack a little bit about the importance of kind of a winsome conviction, the winsomeness being the soft edges, the conviction being the firm center. Jesus came full of truth, firm center, full of grace, soft edges. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Firm center. Love your neighbors, yourself. So it's not half of each. It's not one or the other. It's living fully into both. It's the gospel, and this is what Christian colleges need to be about, and maybe reflect on how we should be that more, taking both into consideration, and reflect on maybe your own formation at
Yeah.
Lipscomb.
Well, I think when we're talking about how does the United States, unique nation, this unique culture function best? How is it designed to function? And one of the things that I think is a really important concept that we don't talk about enough is this concept called ordered liberty. And this is a concept that you can write books on it, but let me just oversimplify for a minute through the use of two founding fathers quotes. So one is the famous declaration and the Declaration of Independence that we're endowed by our creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And then Jefferson goes on to say it's essentially, this is why governments were instituted among men. The primary role of the government is to protect this liberty. So that's like the mission statement of the United States of America. Aspirational, it was not lived up to, we know. It's still not fully lived up to, we know, but that was the aspiration. And then the Bill of Rights, which is this really one of the uh, a world historical outline of sort of fundamental human rights, from free speech to religious liberty to due process, freedom from cruel and unusual punishment. Those are like that makes these aspirations operational. Again, not perfectly, certainly, but they're aspirational and we're trying to live up to them. So that's the liberty part that says, that's when a CCCU university says to a government that says, we want to dictate, you know, your your hiring policies, the way in which you engage in spiritual formation with your students. You say, no, 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 no. I have these First Amendment rights, this right of free speech, this right of religious liberty. It's your responsibility to protect my liberty. But then John Adams turns around, and John Adams says in a letter to the Massachusetts militia, at length, he says, look, this Constitution uh, provides us with liberty that if we exercise it, um, and if we're libertine with it, that we would turn the United States into a miserable habitation. And he has these famous words. He says, our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people, is wholly inadequate to the governance of any other. So when I look at my institution possessed, Lipscomb possessed liberty for a purpose, and the purpose was in spiritual formation. The purpose was to teach citizens of this country not just obedience to Jesus Christ, but also Christian citizenship within this community. And so, in my mind, when you have each look at each one of these CCCU universities as its own vine and its own fig tree, and a lot of times we think, well, how can we make sure that that vine and fig tree is completely safe from outside attack, which is important, but also what do we do within that vine and what do we do within that fig tree? And I think that those two formulations from the Jefferson to the Adams about liberty, but for a purpose, a higher purpose, is one of the ways in which I think, and each CCCU university, each Christian institution in this country has there are different theologies, there are different purposes, there are different mission statements, but it's that exercise of liberty for virtuous purpose that I think is, you've often seen when these universities and when these institutions are at their best, that's what we see.
Yeah, and the virtues matter to us. And one of my concerns is that when our rising generation of students, and this is not new, but they see in leaders um, um, a less than virtuous way of living, though they are proclaiming virtuous truths of how they live. So, and I think, and I assume that you would agree that the greatest damage to the gospel, at least in my mind, is hypocrisy, right? Those who flaunt the name of Jesus and live and act in ways that are neither gracious nor truthful. And I'm really tired of witnessing among too many Christians who care more about power and silencing dissenting voices and care more about access and money and privilege and whatever than they care about truth, and they care about reconciliation, then they care about holiness and genuine humility of loving others above themselves. It's a terrible model for Christians, and this hypocrisy happens on the left and the right. So we need to rise above this. So any thoughts that these young, mostly 18 to 22-year-olds who are listening to this
Yeah.
podcast, uh, to encourage them on what they're seeing right now, which is deeply despairing for them?
I think where you will see there's sort of a couple of categories of hypocrisy that we've seen over the last several decades. I mean, there's sort of what you would call the old school hypocrisy that has plagued a lot of religious institutions. That would be the philandering pastor, for example, or the fraud, the ministry leader who commits fraud, or this sort of going back to when I was coming of age in college and law school. It was the Swaggart and the Jim Baker kind of scandals. And those scandals, they were disturbing because the facts themselves were terrible. The facts that people were often able to thrive as charlatans for so long, that was dispiriting. But when the charlatans were discovered, nobody was saying that was actually okay. That, look, Jim Baker, sure, he's got something going on with a woman who's not his wife, but look at all the good he does otherwise. We shouldn't hold him accountable that because the ends there, the Heritage USA, this big amusement park that used to exist. Look how great that is, and let's just let Jim Baker meet Jim Baker as long as these places are thriving. Once they were found out, then there was accountability. We have a little bit different kind of hypocrisy now. We have a kind of hypocrisy where people engage in either lie or defend lies, are abusive or defend abusers, so long as what they're accomplishing is deemed to be virtuous. And this is specifically in politics often. So essentially what we've said to a lot of rising Christian generations is almost unlike any other area of life, if you're a Christian in politics, your focus is on issues, okay? Is religious liberty being protected? Is abortion being opposed? And we don't talk about means to those ends. We don't talk about that. And now think about how different that is from almost every other area of life. If you're looking at a young Christian businessman, do you say your purpose, Christian businessman, is to make money? No, you would say there's a holistic gospel-centered approach in your presence in your company or your presence as an employee. Your purpose, Christian student, is to make A's. Well, no, that's just such a thin description of your purpose. Well, your purpose, Christian, in politics is to pass laws. No, that is a purpose, right? That is a purpose. But what we've often said about politics is we define ourselves by the issues and not by our conduct, not by our alliances. And so we have created a kind of persistent hypocrisy and a hypocrisy that we then defend because we have defined the object of our engagement as issue focused almost to the exclusion of everything else, which has allowed us to engage in an awful lot and to defend an awful lot of godless behavior so long as it has a godly goal.
Hmm. That ties into what you have talked about when you've characterized the partisan mind,
Mhm.
failing to identify, behaviors and attitudes on um, your side that you condemn on the other side, right? I
Yeah.
guess that's a type of hypocrisy. So what do you have to say to these students and leaders at Christian colleges about being characterized by the way we interact about politics and issues, and not just known by our own policy differences? And then as we think about our students, how do you suggest CCCU institutions can help educate the next generation of politically engaged students who, in your words, avoid the partisan mind?
Yeah. So that is, I was speaking at John Brown University back in, oh goodness, early
Right before you
2020s.
came to Biola, I would say. Yeah, it was back
Yeah.
in.
Well, no, that was my debate with Eric Metaxas. Months
Okay,
before that, I spoke at
okay,
John Brown, and I said those words: avoid the partisan mind. And what I did not mean don't vote, for partisans. I did not even mean don't run for office as a Republican or a Democrat. What I meant was a mindset that the best thing I can compare it to is being a lawyer. When you're a lawyer for a client, one of the things that you're doing is you're amplifying your client's virtues and you're minimizing your client's flaws. That's sort of your that's your day-to-day reality in litigation. My job is to make my client look better than he is. Um, and my opponent's job is to make my client look worse than he is. And a jury sorts it all out. But what I found is that when you adapt the partisan mind, what ends up happening is you essentially become almost like an unpaid lawyer for one party or the other party. And so what you're always doing is you're looking at ways to amplify what's good about your side and minimize what's bad, and then flip it around on the other side. Now, that works in a criminal justice system that has been set up as an adversarial system with rules and ethical boundaries and rules of evidence. When you're a Christian interacting with the culture, what it does is it comes across as inherently deceptive. Inherently deceptive. Any sort of exaggeration or rationalization comes across as inherently deceptive. See the truth and respond to the truth for what it is and according to what it is. And one of the things that I urge students to do is reconnect with Micah 6:8. Reconnect with Micah 6:8, because Micah 6:8 is one of the most powerful verses in the Bible. And what does the Lord require of you, a man? What is good? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord your God. And in this moment, this highly polarized moment, all of us get the act justly part. I know what's right. I know what's right, and I'm going to pursue what is right. But these are three interlocking obligations. We forget the love mercy, or depending on the translation, love kindness. And we absolutely forget walking humbly. And in the political context, I think what walking humbly often means is it is a transformational, it is a transformational moment in your mind in politics. When you look at any given huge issue, abortion, racism, economic inequality, you name it, and you say, and you just begin with these two statements: this is really hard, and I don't have all the answers. If you just begin like that, it can be quite transformational in your interactions with your fellow man.
Yeah, I've seen you do that with issues like critical race theory, the nuances of that, acknowledging there are presuppositions that are fundamentally contrary and antithetical to the gospel, but like anything, we engage deeply in issues and not necessarily throwing babies out with bathwaters. If we have time, we might get to that. But I want to talk about the mind for a minute, because Christian colleges, we share a common mission. We want to graduate students who love the Lord with all their heart, with all their soul, with all their mind, and of course, love their neighbor as themselves. And so it's a goal of Christian discipleship within the framework of the Christian Academy, to learn to love the Lord with their mind. I was just recently listening to my dear friend, and probably yours, Ed Stetzer. He's at Wheaton College's Billy Graham Center. He was interviewed on NPR. And he talked about Mark Knoll's book. You might have heard him interview, but the book that came out a number of years ago, many years ago, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind.
Mm-hmm.
And Ed's comment was this. He said, I think the scandal of the evangelical mind today is the gullibility that so many have been brought into, conspiracy theories, false reports, and more. And so I think the Christian responsibility is we need to engage in what we call in the Christian tradition discipleship. If there ever should be a people who care about the truth, it should be people who call themselves followers of Jesus. And I think pulpits and Christian colleges and universities need to ask the question, how are we going to disciple our people so that they engage the world around them in robust and Christ-like ways? That was a lot of words in there, David, but how would you answer that question that Ed is asking and really responding to the statement that Ed is making on how minds have somehow been co-opted and ideas haven't looked at the complexities, and we're quick to buy into what feeds our ecosystem appetites?
Yeah, that's the gullibility point there, which is tied also to another issue, two other issues: gullibility tying to fear, tying to anger. These issues are huge. And I think a lot of people who are intellectual Christians on Twitter are missing what is happening at the grassroots in many, especially in sort of white evangelical world, of belief in some of the wildest and most bizarre conspiracy theories held closely to their heart by evangelicals. And I think, and you're also might be missing, and depending on where you are again, but a lot of people are missing sort of this real ocean of grievance, this sense of that we have been disrespected, we have been shamed, we've been held in contempt, and we're sick of it. We're tired of it. And the fact of the matter is, there have been an awful lot of people who have disrespected Christians unfairly, who have held Christians in contempt unfairly. You can find that. Absolutely, you can find that. But the problem with that is, what is our response? And our response should not be deep-seated anger and grievance. That should not be our response, because what is happening with this deep-seated anger and grievance, it's totally wiping out the walk humbly and loving kindness parts of Micah 6:8. Totally. It's placing us under the position of, we are the righteously wronged. We're extremely, extremely angry about that. And it's eliminating introspection. It's eliminating it. What I'm beginning to find is that it is becoming increasingly difficult to speak to Christian audiences unless you first walk into the conversation and say, you're good people, you're awesome people, the left is bad. Okay, I have this nit to pick. So there's this sort of sense in which you're walking into it, and you first have to meet sort of the grievance. And the difficulty with that is, I feel like there has to be, and there should be, some repenting from the grievance. There needs to be some repenting from the anger and the grievance before we can break through here, and before we can really dive into discipling. And it's very hard to do that, because a lot of that grievance has been empowered by an awful lot of lies. It's been empowered by a lot of people who are quite self-interested in hyping your fear and your concern and your anger and your rage. It provides these other people with money. It provides them with power. And it makes you, all of these lies make you vulnerable to more lies. I'll give you a perfect example. If your belief is that, for example, the left hates you, not that individual people on the left hate you, the left, the whole left hates you, it is a short trip from there to believing that the left would steal an election. So if you have this background level of anger and suspicion and hostility, the next turn of the screw is easy. We've even seen it go into QAnon. If the left hates you and they would steal an election and they want to destroy the church, how bad are they? Are they so bad as to be pedophiles? Each layer of animosity breeds the next layer. And so we have a lot of work to do, because this is the product of decades of stoking of anger and of rage. And there is just an ocean of grievance out there.
And anger and rage can also be endemic to the academy. Even the academy that does not claim to be faith-based,
Yes.
as we know. And so you talked about it a little bit earlier, and one of the byproducts of our polarized age is a cancel culture. And I know you can define that in different ways, but just generally just the threats to free speech on campuses. And we even feel this tension on Christian college campuses where
Mhm.
we want to champion viewpoint diversity from a biblically faithful perspective, but we also sometimes, in the old words of Tiny Tim, which nobody remembers who's listening to this, because maybe you have to tiptoe through the tulips. You have to be
Yeah.
overly careful. What happens if you say the wrong thing? I was actually at a college campus recently, and they had a speech code that was simply this: say whatever you want, as long as you say it civilly, and say whatever you want as long as you demonstrate that you've thought about it deeply with intellectually defensible arguments. That's the free speech. That's their
Mhm.
speech code. So, what would you say, as former president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE? It's what's the way forward on Christian college campuses as it relates to the delicate nature of what should be said and what shouldn't be said? Do you have some general rules of thumb for us?
It's funny. I have both. I have good experience, and I think I have some decent general rules of thumb. It's interesting. I went to Lipscomb University from '87 to '91. At the time, Lipscomb was a much more socially and politically conservative place. It was much more almost entirely the student body was from the a cappella Churches of Christ, and now it's much more diverse on every possible ground. But I had a much healthier free speech environment in at Lipscomb University than I had at Harvard Law School, where people were shouting you down if they disagreed with you, where they were filling, in certain circumstances, filled my inbox, my physical inbox, because I didn't have email back then, with not death threats, but death aspirations, things like, why don't you go die? And the interesting thing about Lipscomb was that we didn't really even have a speech code other than don't curse. And so I discussed we questioned all the tenets of the faith. We had healthy, robust discussions of politics, of faith, of culture, um, and all with sort of basically clean language. So essentially, it was a viewpoint, it welcomed viewpoint diversity, even though there was still an overwhelming ideological point of view and religious point of view. At Harvard, there was an opposite overwhelming ideological and religious point of view, and it did not welcome dissent at that time. Now that changed, and now a lot of it is changing back. But here's the basic difference between the free speech challenge on campuses now compared to, say, 20 years ago. 20 years ago, it was much more common for free speech to be inhibited top down. And by that, I mean actual laws and regulations passed by public universities called speech codes that were that violated the Constitution. It took years of litigation to get rid of those. They're a vanishing breed now, a speech code. Colleges were proud in the late 1980s, early 1990s to say we're explicitly trying to regulate speech. And it was very top down. Beginning at about 2014, 2015, and Greg Lukianoff, my successor at FIRE, has made this point. The demand for censorship began to bubble from the bottom up. So what once was a dean of students saying, you can't say that, became 200 students in the quad saying, you can't say that, which is a very different free speech challenge. Recently there was a controversy over some at the University of Dallas, Catholic college, in the last few days, where a coalition of people came from outside and some inside the university to try to get the university to silence a teacher who disagreed with some of the Biden transgender legal guidance. That is different from the way things were for a very long time. In that circumstance, University of Dallas resisted the call to punish this teacher. And so what I think the challenge you have often is that how do you deal with the grassroots demand for censorship much more than a top-down demand? And that's very difficult. And I think what we have to do is we have to go back to first principles of teaching people that free speech has value. It's not just that good speech has value. Free speech has value. And one of the ways in which I try to do that is because a lot of the efforts to censor now come from people who are hoping to protect historically marginalized communities. And yet it's the historically marginalized communities that have led the battle for free speech. Um, if you want to read one of the most stirring calls towards free speech in the whole history of the United States, read Frederick Douglass's call for free speech in Boston. He calls free speech the dread of tyrants, the great moral renovator of society and government. I remember talking to Reverend Walter Fauntroy, who was one of the people who helped found the Congressional Black Caucus, instrumental in the civil rights movement, asking him, why was there such progress in civil rights in such a short amount of time, relatively historically speaking, in the late 50s, moving into the early and mid 60s? And his answer was really interesting. Almighty God and the First Amendment. He said, the First Amendment gave us the ability to speak, and Almighty God softened men's hearts. And so one of the things that I try to do is I try to teach people that free speech has value by itself. That doesn't mean that there aren't laws against, there shouldn't be rules against defamation and threats and et cetera, obscenity, but free speech has value. And I think that a Christian universities, by and large, should not just model the protection of speech, but should model the virtuous exercise of speech. And those two things, as we said, going back to ordered liberty, that's sort of hand in hand, the liberty for virtuous purpose, and to model that discussion. It's funny, when I go to a Christian college, I often feel more free to speak than almost anywhere else. And not because I'm a Christian there, because I'm often disagreeing completely with an awful lot of people. But I think CCCU universities have done, by and large, a pretty good job at cultivating an atmosphere of real debate and disagreement and dialogue.
Yeah, I think that is the irony in the maybe the unknown dimension of Christian colleges. And got a lot of friends that are presidents of schools like Biola, and just, we're all concerned about how this rising generation, how they can really step into the messiness and live out the way of kindness in this increasingly polarized and mean-spirited culture. And that trifecta that you gave us, to do justly, to love kindness, which is really what it means, what you said, and to walk humbly, in the rubble of so much that's happening right now. I believe that's the way forward. And I agree with you that Christians are to make an impact in the world for the cause of Christ. And of course, when doing so the right way, they do it for the social good. So, we still need to stand up and fight for our convictions. But more often, this combative and defensive posturing, it's got to give way to listening and civility. And sometimes we listen while waiting to respond, and we don't listen while wanting to learn. And we've got to, that's the walk humbly part, especially in these ideological skirmishes that are a toxin to our culture in so many ways. So, yeah.
One thing real quick about the walk humbly aspect. I think if you're in leadership, fostering an atmosphere of free speech is a manifestation of walking humbly, because what does that do? It provides a permission structure for critique of authority.
Yeah.
And so it's a sort of a manifestation, and it's also a reflection, I think, of culture of free speech, of the, scripture says we see through a glass darkly, we know in part. And so when we're permitting a structure of free speech, what we're doing is we're saying, it's a very tangible way of saying, I don't have all the answers. I need to hear more.
Yeah, well, I know you haven't traveled much lately, but just imagine yourself in a room with a dozen students from a Christian college, and what final word of encouragement or advice would you offer to them that you'd want them to remember long after they turn off this podcast?
I would say, given the cultural, in our cultural moment, which is festering in grievance and anger, is I would just say, God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power and love and of sound mind. And that no matter where if you're a sort of a red Christian in blue America, a blue Christian in red America, have confidence that when you are walk into the public square with confidence and without fear, but also, of course, the humility we talk about in Micah 6:8. I think that what we're a lot of younger Christians are coming into the public square, looking at it, seeing all the anger, seeing all the rage, and recoiling. And so what that means is sometimes some of the best voices, some of the people who are the most loving, the most countercultural, are the least present in our public discourse. And that's got to change. There's this really powerful study by a group called the More in Common Project that studied the hidden tribes of the United States, and not just red and blue, but all, the shades in between. And what it found is that there was something called an exhausted majority. And that's a majority of Americans. They're not all moderates. They're not all in the middle, but of whatever ideological stripe, who look at this awful public discourse and this terrible divisiveness, and they've kind of pulled away. And I see that with a lot of Christians on campuses. Some of the best people, people I want to hear more from, they just say it's not worth it. And I don't think we're going to reclaim this culture and sort of redeem this culture much as long as that phrase exhausted majority, the operative word is exhausted more than majority.
Mm.
And I think that we all have an awful lot of people in the body of Christ who have good things to say, who are grieved by what is happening in this country and are recoiling because of the toxic nature of the discourse. And it reminds me of the sinner does not hold, and the best lack all conviction.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that is a lot of that describes our moment in many ways. And I would say that in some of the best people I've ever known need to recover their conviction and live it in that sort of Micah 6:8 sense.
Yeah, living in confidence. I love that. Confidence is a word we don't live into enough. I mean, if I'm right, it comes from the Latin con with, fides, faith. We live by faith and not by sight. So, I mean, even though we don't have all the answers, I think there is a confidence that we have as Christians that we shouldn't, that should make us, embolden us and not make us more cowardly. Final question, whether this is on the record or off the record, how's your precious granddaughter doing?
Oh, she is doing incredibly well. She's our miracle baby. She was diagnosed at about 20 weeks with some very grave birth defects, and for a long time things seemed very, very grim. And then literally in the last 3 to 4 weeks of my daughter's pregnancy, she improved dramatically in the womb and received a surgery that was first of its kind in Vanderbilt Children's Hospital in Tennessee, and a 2 to 3 month NICU stay that was expected turned into about 2.5 weeks. And now she's in Knoxville, Tennessee, where my oldest daughter is a senior at the University of Tennessee with her husband and my wife, who is helping my daughter get some sleep.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And she's just doing so well. And so many people prayed for her. I'd put updates in my Sunday newsletters, and she's just doing so well. And we're just so grateful to God.
That's wonderful to hear. We've been reading about that in your Sunday newsletters, and I know folks that don't even know much about you who read that are praying. So that's what the body of Christ does. Well, we just had a wonderful conversation with our guest, David French, author, commentator, brother in Christ. David, thank you for the time today. Thank you for sharing these real nuggets of wisdom, and even more than nuggets, with these friends that we have in Christian colleges across the country and really around the world. And we're delighted you said yes to this invitation, and we wish you all God's best in the days ahead. David
Thank you.
French.
And it's so good to see you again.
Good to see you, my friend. Take care.